Leon Emirali is a former government advisor. Leon, good afternoon to you.
Afternoon, Ian. Hello.
Nice to have you with us. So, Leon, I mean, look, you're not a Labour supporter, but nonetheless, what is your? Would you just give us your overarching assessment, firstly, of this incredible result for Keir Starmer?
Yeah, I mean, it's a huge result. It's a condemnation, I think, of 14 years of Conservative government. The nation have clearly made their thoughts felt. And I thought that Rishi Sunak's speech was a very dignified and quite a positive speech, really. The fact that he was able to apologise to the country, I think, was big of him.
Well, let's on that point, while you mention that, Leon, let's just have a little listen to that very line that Mr Sunak came out with last night.
To the country, I would like to say, first and foremost, I am sorry. I have given this job my all, but you have sent a clear signal that the government of the United Kingdom must change, and yours is the only judgment that matters. I have heard your anger, your disappointment, and I take responsibility for this loss.
There it is. Just, I suppose, an example of my jet lag there, Leon. Of course, that wasn't last night. That was about 2 hours ago. So there we are. That's the former Prime Minister now speaking. Very humble, very apologetic.
Yeah, I think he had to be, Ian, because, this was not a good night for the Conservatives. It goes without saying. It was in actual fact probably worse than a lot of people thought. There was an understanding that maybe the Conservatives would outperform the polls that we'd seen in the weeks prior to the election. Maybe the Conservatives would get a little bit closer to Labour than we've seen. But 121 seats is a really bad result for the Tories.
But it's interesting just on that point, because lots of people are making this point as well who are texting in to us. This wasn't a win for Labour based on, some sort of Starmer philosophy, some sort of inner wisdom and guidance and big idea. This was almost a win kind of by default. I don't want to take anything away from the man's success, because it's huge. It's huge partly because of our voting system, but it certainly wasn't based on some ideological direction of travel.
No, and you're right, Keir Starmer and his team deserve a lot of credit, because this has got to be one of the most efficient campaigns in political history. To win that many seats on a relatively small vote share is quite something. And there isn't this sort of Tony Blair sense of enthusiasm for Keir Starmer, I don't think. It isn't necessarily, we love this guy and we can't wait to see what he's going to do for the country. Yeah. I think it's more about, we didn't like the Conservatives and we want to give change a go, because it has felt that the country's become too stagnant and isn't moving anywhere. So a return to competency, I think. But ultimately, what Starmer said on the steps in his speech, I thought was quite striking. It sounded a bit conservative, can I say, Ian? He was talking about, a light touch of government, a light touch of politics on people's lives, a restoration to decency and public service. It sounds like the old school conservatism that maybe we were used to in the 90s and in the 80s. And I think what he's trying to do is appeal to a very broad base of people, which he has to. But that's difficult for him, because over time there are going to be factions in that Labour majority, and it could come to bite him.
Indeed. Some high-profile scalps were taken, of course, last night, notably Liz Truss, Jacob Rees-Mogg, etc. And Grant Shapps, of course, he was, up until a couple of hours ago, the Defence Secretary. And when he discovered he'd lost his seat, this was his warning about Labour's position on looking after the safety of our country.
It's clear tonight that Britain will have a new government in the morning, and I am extremely concerned that unless it quickly commits to spend 2.5% of GDP on defence, our armed forces may suffer, and so will our friends in Ukraine.
There it was. That's a clear warning. That should not be ignored. He was the Defence Secretary, Leon. Do you sense that Labour will get to that 2.5%, which is, of course, the golden number in this area? Do you think they'll get to that early doors or kick it into the long grass?
I think they have to. I think they have to, Ian. I think that the first phone calls that Keir Starmer makes to other world leaders, to Joe Biden, to Macron in France, to Zelensky in Ukraine, there is going to be a demand for the Labour government to meet their defence commitments. And I think it's also well worth noting that Keir Starmer is going to be flying off to the NATO summit in Washington early next week, one of his first sort of international diplomatic moments, as it were. And he's going to be hearing from fellow NATO members, we need Britain's leadership on defence. So I think they have to get there. But that, again, is an example of where there might be some resistance in the Labour Party. The likes of Angela Rayner, perhaps, who perhaps aren't as hawkish on defence. They might want to see a reduction in defence spending, or they might not want to reach that 2.5%. And it's going to cause problems for Starmer in the long term. But I think international pressure is going to be too much for Starmer to ignore. And I think they have to get to that 2.5% very quickly.
Let's have a listen then to Penny Mordaunt, who, as memory serves me, was also a former Defence Secretary very briefly. But of course, seen by many parts of the party, or she was seen as somebody who might become a leader. Not everybody's cup of tea, but there was certainly an appetite for her. The one thing most people agree on is that she was an incredible talker, great speeches at the dispatch box, particularly at the expense of the SNP. We will miss those. And I thought this was one of the most dignified moments of the night. Have a look.
Tonight, the Conservative Party has taken a battering because it failed to honour the trust that people had placed in it. You can speak all you like of security and freedom, but you can't have either if you are afraid. Afraid about the cost of living or accessing healthcare, or whether the responsibility you shoulder will be recognised and rewarded. That fear steals the future, and it only makes the present matter, and that is why we lost. And if we want again to be the natural party of government, then our values must be the people's.
And that is it. I mean, she did go on, as I was alluding to, Leon, to be very kind to her successor. And she was clearly quite emotional as well when she was giving that speech. Was she ever going to be the person to lead the party, though? She's really looking for, just suggesting that the Tories need to find their identity.
Yeah, look, I think what always happens with the Conservatives after an electoral defeat is they have this big post-mortem, and 9 times out of 10, the knee-jerk reaction is, we weren't right-wing enough. That's why we lost the election. And the difficulty now is you are never going to out-reform reform. And the fact that Farage is in Parliament, I think, shows you that, and he's going to take to the airwaves, and he's going to be a real nuisance in the Conservative side and Labour's side. And I think, personally, someone like Penny Mordaunt, who has got national appeal, who has strong convictions, old-fashioned Conservative values, she would have been a perfect leader to get the Conservatives back on footing to win the election. And, you know, my fear is that the Conservatives try and install perhaps a Kemi Badenoch or perhaps a Suella Braverman to try and move to the right of reform, and you're simply not going to be able to do it in this political environment. I think the Conservatives are better off coalescing around the centre, a strong opposition to Keir Starmer and the Labour Party, and I think that puts them in the best position for 2029. But if they don't do that, it could be another 5 years in the wilderness, and who knows beyond.
Yeah, that is the real danger, finding out what is their territory, where do they instinctively go now. Listen, Leon, thank you for your time, really appreciate it. Leon Emirali, who is, of course, a former government advisor.